So now I am so excited to introduce our speaker for today. So Aziz is a global peace builder, a cultural educator, and an author. So he's a Palestinian whose journey from radical seeking revenge to peacemaking, a peacemaker seeking reconciliation has led to an innovative method of peacemaking and co-founding of a global business, which is called Medji, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, Tours. And it has a goal of harnessing the power of travel to create a more peaceful world. Whew, I love all of that. So his global conflict resolution work earned him the titles of National Geographic Explorer and TED Fellow. He's been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and National Geographic. And he recently launched in 2020 his new book called Crossing Boundaries, A Traveler's Guide to World Peace. And that is just a very small snippet of absolutely everything he's done. So I will let Aziz tell us more about his wonderful background and what we can look forward to and what he is providing to us today in terms of reimagining travel. So without further ado, I will let you take it from here. Aziz, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you. And let me just trying to figure out my presentation. I'm glad to be here with you. As you mentioned earlier, it's just I'm reporting kind of almost from the future. So even though it's at 3 a.m. here, I'm really happy being in Jerusalem because life is a little bit different in Jerusalem. I just traveled to see my family. That's where they're from, and everyone I know in Jerusalem is vaccinated, and so things have pretty much opened up. And you can meet people in person and you still have to use masks here and there, but pretty much it's somewhat back to life that we knew to some level before. And the first couple of days I've arrived here was really weird to just get back to giving people hugs and just shake hands and stuff like that. And I'm very extrovert, and I still was literally traumatized by how normal it is to see friends and our family and just to be normal, and it's fantastic. So I just wanted to start with that. Unfortunately, it's not true everywhere around here. So just like half an hour away in Ramallah, my family there unfortunately don't have the same reality. But still, just being in Jerusalem and seeing that. And experiencing that has been incredible. It's been a year I haven't seen my family. But away from that, I'm gonna share my screen. Let me make sure I share the right screen. Here we go. Yep, I just did. And I want to talk to you about reimagining travel. And really, I built this from the book I just published, Crossing Boundaries, and there's a lot we can go more focus in here. And I wanted to talk about crossing boundaries, reimagining travel, because despite the fact we are more connected today than ever before through internet, through, we can do all these Zoom talks, you can learn about anything, anytime, anywhere in the world within a second. It's just so easy to be connected. And yet, despite that, we live in a world still that is tremendously divided between all kind of identities that we have, that we divide as us versus them. And we kind of have to always, whether it's Jewish, Arab, or black and non-black, or right and left, or it could go so much more into whichever team it is in soccer or American football, I guess for you would be more accurate to talk about that you support. But there's so much of the us versus them that we build our identity on. And so my work has been focused in the last 20 plus years on how can we put cracks in the walls that divide us in the world, and how can we connect people, have those kind of meaningful connection. And for me, travel is the best way to do that. I've worked in conflict resolution for over 20 years, and I've worked in places from Afghanistan to to Syria, to Colombia, to the US, all kind of interesting and intractable conflicts. And my actually conclusion out of those experiences is that we need to find a more sustainable way to connect human beings with each other, to push each other to learn more about the other, whoever that the other is, to understand each other more. And as I was doing this with a colleague of mine in places like Afghanistan, we were connecting enemies and having dialogues there. We're like, how can we do this in a more sustainable way? And the answer came out as travel. And I know that maybe sounds like, how do you come from connecting enemies to travel? But the reason we thought travel is the best is because over 1.4 billion people traveled internationally in 2019. And we thought, wow, this is the biggest exchange program that happens in the world. And those who travel are often open to new ideas, to learning something different than anyone else. And then people who travel to your own destinations, you kind of more open to meeting often with them. And there is that potential. And yet it doesn't, unfortunately, happen enough. And so as we're talking today about reimagining travel, I hope we can talk about this more. My first experience with travel happened when I was a little kid. That's me, the small kid here. And I know you're thinking, you used to look a really cute boy, and that didn't continue as I grew older. Um, I remember going to school in Al Aqsa Mosque, which in Jerusalem is the holiest spot for Muslims. And right in the mosque, there was actually school in the vicinity of the mosque. And because it's the holiest spot in the city for Muslims, and because it has a Dome of the Rock, and it's like this old 1300-year-old building, tons and tons and tons of tourists would pour in every day. And so I would watch these tourists, and I wanted to talk to them, and I'll come by and say, hello, what's up? You know, I knew only like 3 words in English, but I would come and try to talk to them. I was fascinated by these people who looked different than me, and you know, they had these cameras and they were snapping photos of everything, and they would see me, and like you can tell, I was photogenic. I'm already here posing for photos, and I would come to them and pose for a photo, and they'll snap my photo, and I actually liked it. I loved the attention. It was kind of cool. So I would do that. The problem is then I would want to say my hello, how are you? But very few of them, almost none, would really stay and talk, because they took their photo and just moved on. And that made me feel very objectified. And so I grew up with that, actually a bit of a negative image of a travel, being a little upset at, like, I want to talk to you. Can you, you know, I wasn't going to have long conversations, but can you spend 5 minutes before you move on and talk to me? So that's my first view of travel. Um, my real first encounter with travel was when I was a teenager, as in the way I'm talking about it, of crossing boundaries. Now, I told you I grew up very, or I've been for the last 20 years working on conflict resolution and bringing people together. But the truth is, as a child, that's not how I grew up. I didn't believe in conflict resolution. I didn't believe in bringing people together. As a teenager, I didn't believe in any of that at all. And so it's only when I was 18, I made my first meaningful trip. And before I tell you about it, I have to explain why it was meaningful. Because growing up in Jerusalem, I lived in a conflict zone. I lived in a place where Israelis and Palestinians fought with each other. I'm Palestinian, and as a kid, you know, I didn't fully understand why Israelis and Palestinians fought. I didn't fully understand what was happening around me. You're 7 years old, you don't do that. But I remember coming home one day and telling my mom, I'm quitting school. I was maybe 7 or 8. I said, I'm quitting school. This whole idea of school is stupid. I'm not going anymore. And as a normal thing a mother would say is like, what do you mean you quitting school? You're 7, you 8, you don't get a chance to quit school. That's not your decision. And I told her, I don't think it's worth it. It's not worth dying for a school. So she asked me what was happening. And I said, well, we got fired at tear gas. There were clashes between young people and the military, the Israeli army. And I'm just not going to go through being tear gassed again. And my mom had to think about how to convince me to go to school. And it's not easy to convince an 8-year-old, but this is to go to school through tear gas, but this is what happens in a conflict zone. In different conflicts, it would happen differently, but there's this fear you grow up with. And her way of dealing with it was giving me an onion and telling me that every time I get tear gas, I put that onion close to my nose and I breathe that onion in, and it would actually help you not suffocate. And I thought growing up for many years, unfortunately, I did have to use it quite a few times. And I don't know if it works or not, if it's real or placebo, but it worked for me. It made me feel more confident. And I grew up thinking everyone around the world, when you go to school, you probably also use an onion. And it took me years later to realize apparently that's not a normal thing. But that's just to give you an idea of what does it mean to grow up in a conflict zone. Now, the earlier photo you saw, my brother Taysir, that's him again. He's my older brother. I'm the youngest of 7. I'm what you call the oops child. Wasn't planned for, which 9 years after Taysir was born, I came on. I tease my parents because they religious Muslims, they don't drink alcohol. I'm like, how can I be the oops child if there was no wine involved? It doesn't add up, but they don't think it's funny. I do. But because I'm the youngest, my older brother Taysir was literally the person in charge of my life. I'm the youngest of 7, but he was the person given that responsibility. My first day in school, it was him who took me to school. If I had any issues in school, he would be the one showing up. Any fight in the neighborhood, he'll be the one. Everything I learned was literally through him. And when I was 10 years old, Taysir died as a result of being beaten up, arrested, beaten up by Israeli soldiers. He was beaten up so they would get a confession from him that he threw stones at soldiers. He was arrested from home. Um, and taken into jail, beaten up until he eventually said whatever they wanted, but took a couple of weeks before he did. And by the time he was released from prison, he was pretty much on his deathbed. And soon after, in the hospital, he passed away. I was 10 years old when that happened. And I want you to put yourself in a place of a 10-year-old kid and think, what would you do if your brother was killed in front of you? How would you behave? What's the first thought that would come through your mind? And for me, the first thing I thought about is if somebody hurts me, I want to hurt them back. And for 8 years, that's the only thought I really had in my mind. It changed my whole life. I grew up angry, bitter, and all I wanted was revenge. And that's what I focused on. I became active in politics, organizing, throwing rocks myself, all of that, until I was 18 years old. And I was 18 years old. I ended up going through an amazing change. I went to study Hebrew. And it was my first time meeting Israelis, Jews, on a human level. And it was crazy because those people lived literally 10 minutes from my house, walking distance. And yet they never met me and I never met them. They didn't know me and I didn't know them. And so my first real trip of my life, the real impactful trip of my life, was not thousands of miles away. It was literally crossing the street and meeting my neighbor. And so when we think of travel, I want to challenge you to rethink of what travel is, reimagining the future of travel. Don't think of travel as how far can I go? Think about how it's going to challenge you. how it's going to change the way you're thinking about someone or something. And those, the closest trip to home, it's often the most impactful trip you will ever take, because that trip will change you. It will push you to see things differently. It will challenge your stereotypes more than any other trip. And that's why that's the trip we often avoid because it would do that to us. And I'm very grateful that I did that trip. It was very hard, took me months of struggling to deal with my feelings, my emotions. But eventually, Martin Luther King Jr. really put it perfectly in this quote. Men often hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they cannot communicate. They cannot communicate because they are separated. And I started this talk by saying we are more connected today than ever, but we're still really not communicating with each other. There's still a lot of fear. There's still a lot of lack of knowledge. There's still a lot of separation. And I know for me, when I went that first trip, I was studying Hebrew for the first time in my life. And sitting in a classroom, I was the only Palestinian in the classroom. All my the other students were either tourists or mostly Jewish Israeli immigrants. And that meeting was so scary, but also got me to know the people I didn't know. I mean, the first time I met somebody other than a couple of tourists who loved country music like me was in that classroom. And I'm talking about Western country music. Any fans here? No. I'm a big fan of Western country music, but let me tell you, no Palestinians have ever listened to country music. The only reason I came across is I dated an American who introduced me to it, which was very nice of her because when she broke up with me, I had something to listen to comfort me. So that was very sweet. But in that Hebrew class, I met people who knew what I'm talking about when I say words like Tim McGraw or even Johnny Cash and things like that. And it was so exciting for me. And then we would eventually start talking about more meaningful things and politics and so on, and realizing that we are divided not by actual checkpoints, not by actual walls, which do exist here, but actually by walls that we have in our minds and in our hearts. And I wanted my life to be focused on how we bring down those kind of walls. And so this is where I come from. And I started thinking about how to do that. And it took me years later to figure out one of those concepts, which was starting a company with a Jewish friend. By the way, that's very uncommon here, to having joint businesses, Palestinians and Jews. Very uncommon. In tourism, I only know us actually that has a co-owned 50-50. I started this company, Mejdi, which we had a crazy concept using our background in conflict resolution to try. And it was, let's have two tour guides instead of one per tour, from two different backgrounds. And we started in Jerusalem with one Jewish, one Palestinian. Put them together and see what's going to happen. They're not only talking politics because they're tour guides. They talk about history. They talk about archaeology. They talk about mythology. They talk about I don't know, architecture, about religion, about poetry, about music. But by having two of them together, something new happened. One, usually tour guides like to speak forever, but here you couldn't do that. You have two of them, so it becomes a conversation instead of a speech. And this conversation, they didn't always agree on stuff. And not only again politics, it could be a mythology story, or it could be a story from the Bible, or it could be a folk story. And they would disagree with each other, debate it nicely, not fighting. And suddenly the travelers felt part of a conversation instead of being just the people who are watching what's happening. And they would add and ask questions much more. And so it started a community when you are traveling, instead of this feeling of like, this person tells us information, we passively listen, ask a couple of questions, and that's it. But even that we realize is not enough. So we wanted our travelers to discover wherever they go what the narratives are. And so when I think about reimagining travel, when I think about what's the future of travel, I think the future of travel is understanding that we need to discover more than just the main narrative of the destination we are going to. And you only can do that by starting to meet people who are there, by starting to ask unpopular sometimes questions, going to have dinners with families, meeting people from different walks of life. You don't take only the main narrative, which the tour guide tells you. And if you know how tour guides become tour guides, they are trained in most countries. They are told which narratives they should share. Even in the most democratic countries, they still told the narrative. They want to often give you the beautiful image of the country you are visiting. But that's not the only narrative. You want to go beyond. You want to know the narratives of the different communities that lives there, but even the narratives of the everyday person, the food that the people have. And you can only do that as you start meeting the people in those places, listening to the music. Says one group I took to my family's house. These are my nephews, and just having some fun listening to Arabic and Hebrew music together, which is again uncommon in a place like Jerusalem, dancing together, having just a fun together. But this fun was a different narrative that people didn't know. If you're coming on a pilgrimage tour to Jerusalem, you know the narrative of Jerusalem as a holy city. You don't know the narrative of the music, you don't know the narrative of the people, you don't know the narrative of partying together and doing that stuff. You want to give voice to other narratives that you wouldn't have heard. This is one of my favorite spots. It's in Bosnia. It's called Mostar, and Mostar is a beautiful, beautiful city. Uh, Bosnia in general is not heavily visited place. People would go to Croatia, one of the most visited places in the world, but not cross to Bosnia, missing out on an incredible experience. And there, when I travel, I normally get a Serbian and a Bosnian co-leading trips together, or a Croat, and just hear the different narratives. But there's another interesting thing that you can do when you're traveling alone. I know many people who have come to this city, Mostar, and enjoyed 2, 3 days. It's old bridge, Ottoman bridge, beautiful river. You can do some rafting there. You can go to good restaurants. There's a lot to do around Sufi monuments, beautiful. But what they wouldn't know is that this is one of the most divided cities in the world. In Mostar, half of the population live in one side, the other half live in the other side. And most travelers will go through this city never knowing that divisions. Schools are actually have a division between Catholics, Croat students, and Muslim Bosniak students. Same school. You would go, one part of the school is for Muslims, one part is for Catholics, and those students are told not to meet with each other. It's a very small town, and yet they have two soccer teams, one Catholic and one Muslim. Everything. I remember inviting a speaker to meet with us, and he said, "Where are we meeting?" And I give him the address, and he said, "I can't come there. That's a Catholic side, and I'm Muslim, and I can't go there. You have to change your meeting to the Muslim side for me to meet you." And then the same thing, when I wanted to meet someone from the Catholic side, I had to meet them in the Catholic side of the city. People grow up 20 years old who have not crossed to the other side of the city. And yet travelers will go there, spend 3, 4, 5 days, and not realize that. So the future of travel is really being sensitive and able to ask ourselves, what are the voices that we are not hearing in the destination we are traveling to? And that happens everywhere. Mostar is a good example, but the truth is, it's every country you can go to. United States is one of those. Can you imagine somebody coming to the States, going to New York and saying, "I know everything I can know about America"? That's a narrative of the United States, is New York City. Well, as much as I like New York City, it is not the narrative, the only narrative in America, for sure not. Or you go to Paris or you go to London, you think whatever the main narrative you hear is, but there's so many more. There's a narrative of immigrants, there's a narrative of different communities there. There's like if you're in France, there's a whole North African and immigration, for example, there that would be fascinating to learn about. So wherever you travel, there are other narratives. So there's a photo I took in Bogota, a tour I did that is incredible, talking about other narratives. This is a neighborhood called Egipto, and this is a guy who used to be a top gang leader, killed people, 7 people in his family being killed in gang fight. And last time he was in prison, he decided, I don't want to go to prison again. Let us change the way we're doing it. And instead of stealing from tourists, as he puts it, he said he used to be proud of the fact no tourist would enter his neighborhood and leave with their iPhone. And he said, instead of stealing from tourists, I decided I'm going to become a tour guide. And he would give this tour in his village, in his town, not the whole Bogota, just in his neighborhood, which they filled with the graffitis telling their stories and tell the story of social justice, tell the story of how he became a gang. He converted all his gang members to also become tour guides. And honestly, having been to Colombia over, I don't know, almost a dozen times, this was my favorite tour I've done while I was there, because it just was so authentic, so real, and so honest. And it's different. And I learned so much about this city that I love Colombia a lot. That was just raw and real. And it's a voice that's missing. You can go to the Golden Museum, you can talk about ancient history, you can go to the art museum. It's cool, but you don't really understand Bogota unless you hear the voices that are missing from the normal tours. And that is true everywhere. It's just in Vietnam as well, meeting with people who fought against the US in the war, which for US travelers, especially older travelers, this was hard to do. And yet, this was the most meaningful meeting I've orchestrated between older American travelers and Vietnamese, because these are people who fought in the war, who will tell their stories. And then within an hour, you see them hugging the Americans who sometimes they themselves fought in the war. They'll ask each other questions and then realize we're not in this war anymore. We can move forward. They ask tons of questions, but they talk about how to move forward. And it's just one of my favorite meetings I've attended, bringing travelers from the States to anywhere, honestly. The other thing I think is really important is getting out of big cities. Often when we travel today, we go to these 10 spots that Lonely Planet or Condé Nast or whichever news or travel magazines you read. And the more I've traveled, I realize that's probably one of the biggest mistakes we do, because those 10 spots aren't really telling you the whole story. And the more you're willing to get out of big cities, the more you're gonna feel and understand the place you're traveling to. I went to Tokyo. I was there for work, and I got out of the big city. And I think this is when I really got it, that I need to start getting out of big cities. Tokyo is nice, but there are so many tourists. People have met so many tourists. They're not as interested in talking to you as a traveler because there's just too many. It's a busy city. It's kind of like in New York. And I took a train. I was going into the downtown of Tokyo. And instead, I ended up going into a village way out of Tokyo by mistake. But when it happened, I thought, you know what, this is meant to be. I'm not gonna change it. I'm just gonna get off this station and I'm gonna walk around and see what I'm gonna do. And I ended up in this pub, which you can tell is like very old furniture, very old setup. It's like, look, they haven't changed anything for the last 50 years. Same people who I think attended 50 years ago still go to the same pub. And it ended up being my best night still in Tokyo, or in Japan in general, because I walked in, nobody spoke English, but they were so excited to see a tourist in their city because they've never seen one. They brought these clothes from the back to dress me up like a local. They put on some karaoke. They sang in Japanese, asked me to sing in English. I'm a horrible singer. In Japanese culture is amazing because they still will clap for you regardless of how bad you are and still ask you out of respect to sing again, which I took advantage of and kept singing the whole night. But it was such an amazing night that I could not replicate in a place like Tokyo because it's just too big of a city. And so getting out of those big cities make you go beyond what you can imagine. This is, well, let me ask you, where do you think this is? What time is it so I can stop talking soon? Any thoughts where this is? Anyone? No? Come on, take
It
a
looks
guess.
like India.
It looks
India?
like India. You are right. It looks like India. It's not India. That's why it's a
Iran?
question. Not Iran. So the reason I'm putting this is because it's in a place you would never guess. And that's about getting out of big cities. You will discover beauties. You will discover places that you're like, why is this not in on anybody's list? I didn't even know about this place. So this is in Russia. I was in Russia for the World Cup, and I ended up going to watch a game in the well, not outskirts, 1,000 kilometers from Moscow, in a place called Kazan. You know, not a major destination for travelers. And then out of Kazan, I met a guy from there who says, you know, one of the most beautiful mosques in the world is actually 2 hours drive from here. And I rented a car, me and him got on and drove to there. And I ended up in this spot. And like, how did I never know about like one of the most beautiful mosques in the world? And that what happens when you get out of big cities. You discover that there's so much beauty that we are never told about, that we've never sometimes heard about. I ended up in a church in Russia that was destroyed 100 years ago. Icons is still intact inside that church. Unbelievable that it doesn't show up in any travel destination books. But I ended up there because I met a local who was like, come to lunch in my house. And I went to his home for lunch, ended up being 2 hours away from where I thought it was. That lunch stayed until the next morning because I met his mom and his grandfather, and we kept eating and drinking. And they were so happy to have someone visiting. And they took me around and I saw that church. So those kind of experiences you don't have um, you don't have sometimes in big cities. You have to go beyond. There's a lot to go through. I'm not going to be able to finish, but I'll end with this. Travel for me is about being a storyteller. It's about hearing a story and telling a story. It doesn't mean you don't enjoy time. It doesn't mean when you break stereotypes, when you do all these things, that you don't have fun and all of that, which some people think it's either this or that. Responsible travel versus fun. And I think you can be a responsible travel in the future and still have fun. This is in Machu Picchu. Love the place. I enjoy it so much. Spent 2, 3 days hanging around here. I got up so early so I can take a photo like this where no tourists are still there. I had to convince Islama to pose for a photo. It took me hours of negotiations to do that. And I'm so happy it worked. So I love those things. I love photography so much. So I'll do stuff like this. But still, when I think about these destinations, it's not that photo that comes to my mind when I think of Peru. It's this photo. It's going to a village, middle of nowhere, sitting there, and then this girl walking to me, just like 4 years old, taking my hand and inviting me basically to her home. And I go into this house and people serve me drinks. I get like a tea. I don't speak Spanish. I do a little bit, but it's really bad. They don't speak English. I spend half an hour there talking to the family. And that's my favorite experience there. This girl is what I remember when I think of Peru. When I go to Vietnam, I spent a lot of time trying to get that opening of the net of fishing. But it's this woman I think about when I think of Vietnam. A 90-year-old woman, a farmer, spent time with her and her husband, asking them about the secret to long life. And they eventually told me it was beer. So a daily beer apparently make you live over 90. But the whole time she was laughing, smiling, hugging me. I'm like, I will never forget that moment because there's a story. Ibn Battuta, an Arab traveler, said, travel makes you speechless, but then it turns you into a storyteller. So when I think of the future of travel, I'm gonna stop sharing and we can go into some of these later. When I think of the future of travel, I think about the stories we meet. I think of its potential of healing the world, its potential of making us overcome stereotypes, of learning about things we would not have learned any otherwise. And I think about our role. We are diplomats when we travel in some ways. We are ambassadors, and we think often of the power of what a diplomat has, but a traveler has even more power. Those interactions we decide to have or decide not to have can change the world. Because if 1.4 billion travelers were interacting with locals wherever they went, that means the whole world is interacting with each other differently. We would understand more about each other. We will all change our stereotypes about each other. The power that travel has is unbelievable. We just have to start recognizing that and living in a way that shows how much powerful travel is. So I hope if you take anything from this talk is realize just the power you have when you travel and the abilities you have to be a peacemaker when you are traveling. And I'll stop here and talk, see if you have any thoughts or questions.
Oh my goodness, that was amazing. Yeah, round of applause. Seriously, I'm sure everyone was feeling the same as me. I was holding on to absolutely every word you were saying. You are an amazing storyteller. Oh my goodness, I felt like I was there with everything you were talking about. And I love your just your whole mindset on how travel is going to be moving forward and how you're encouraging others to do that, and just amazing. So completely inspiring and motivational. So thank you, thank you. Yes, riveting. I mean, it's amazing. So wonderful. We've had quite a few questions. I have a lot on my own, but I'll save some of those for the end to get through some of everyone else's. So I am just going to start asking you them. So Abigail was curious, what prompted you to want to study Hebrew?
It wasn't actually because I thought, oh, this is important for reconciliation, peace, and all that. But in Jerusalem, it was mandatory for me to study Hebrew in high school, and I refused to learn it, being Palestinian and angry at that time and being like, oh, they killed my brother, I'm not going to learn their language. And then I realized at 18, if I don't speak Hebrew, I'm not going to go to college, I'm not going to work, I'm not going to have success in life, basically. And it was more or less forced into it. But my first day I come to class, my Hebrew teacher comes and welcomes me in Arabic. And my only experience at that point was with soldiers. And as nice as a soldier can be, they're carrying a gun. You really can't have a normal conversation with somebody carrying a gun. And the fact she welcomed me in Arabic just completely confused me because she was recognizing me as a human being. And that where I started rethinking this whole concept of us versus them and realizing within a couple of months, I realized I'm going to change what us versus them means. Us for me now is those of us who are working for creating change, for creating peace, and them is those who have not joined us yet. And so that happened in that classroom.
Amazing. Wow. What a great experience. I'm curious. I know you mentioned that your stories in Jerusalem. Did you live there your entire life, or did you ever move away?
I did live there until 13 years ago. And then I came to the States. I directed for a few years a center in conflict resolution and at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. That's where I met my business partner. But the way I've been living the last quite a few years is I divide my time between the States and Jerusalem. So I'm usually back every month or two, and I spend a few weeks here, a few weeks in the States, and a few weeks everywhere else. I develop all our pretty much travel experiences for my business. So and I go live in the places I want to develop. So if I'm gonna build a tour in Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia, I go spend sometimes weeks, sometimes months there. I spend time with fortunately, I have, because of my background in conflict resolution and I worked in journalism before a little bit, I know people literally in every country and I just spend time with them. And I build my tours not based on the classic tourism way where, oh, let's figure out what the sites, just spending time meeting people and letting them tell me what they want people to also see. So I still go and see some of the main highlights, and that's easy to find and do, but I try to find the behind the scenes stuff. And so I live Jerusalem, States, and everywhere else every year, probably equal times.
Fantastic. That was kind of what I was going to ask. I was curious about your tours and how you find the guides for them. So it sounds like you actually go, you live there, you meet people. Have you ever picked a country where you have these tours operating that you haven't been there? And if so, how do you find those tour guides?
Almost all I've been there. Trying to think. The only times I haven't is if somebody in our staff hasn't done work there and has some connections that maybe I don't, but majority I have. But I also want to say I try to go beyond just um, a tour guide. Like in Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia, I found the best tour guides to be journalists. So I've been working with few journalists who I've met through my journalism work, and it's amazing what they tell because I want the stories that go beyond just the normal story. In places like Jerusalem, you can't really do that. You need to hire licensed tour guides, and I reach out to a lot of people and see who would come. And then I actually work on even making trainings. And in some countries, there are very little trainings for tour guides, trainings that focus on the stuff we talked about now, trying to convince tour guides that, no, I don't want the classic only story. I want beyond that. And not every guide is willing to do that. I've had a guide in Egypt. My normal guides in Egypt were, well, I booked one and there was misunderstanding. And so I ended up having to get another guide last minute. And I hate to do that. That's usually the worst thing. And none of the guys I worked with who went through our training was available. So I ended up getting this guide who hated the idea of giving other voices to speak. He saw them as a competition. And so everywhere we went, like I take people in Egypt to a place called the Garbage City, which I understand doesn't sound like exciting place to go to from the name, but Garbage City is where like 80,000 Christian Copts live in Cairo. It's called Garbage City because it's the center of recycling in Egypt. Everyone who lives there works in recycling, and it's an innovative place, amazing spot to go to because you figure out they do better recycling work than anywhere else in Europe. And so I love to take people there to see innovation in Egypt in a pretty poor place, and to learn that there are Christians living in Egypt and see them and meet them, not only talk about, oh, there are Egyptian Christians, Copts. So he hated that. He's like, why would we? I can give them the tour there. We don't meet anybody. And so not every guide really enjoys that idea, and we have to find the right tour guides who believe in not just being the only speaker.
Right, that makes sense. Wow. I've never heard of that place you mentioned before. Very intriguing for sure. All right, we have got a lot of questions, you guys. These are amazing. Oh my goodness. All right, so Ali, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, wants to know, do you think responsible travel is possible after the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it is. I look, there are places where travel is income, and this is maybe a mistake that it has built this way, but this is reality today. People's income fully dependent on travel, and so we will. Part of being responsible is to make sure people have their lives back to some level. Places like Tanzania or places I mean, 10% of the world employment is connected to travel. The question is, how do we do it? And I think now there's an opportunity. I'm not always optimistic people will do it, but there's an opportunity of changing the way we travel. And if you look at the Cape Town Declaration about responsible travel, it talks about responsible travel is about making the places we go to better places for those who live there. Not for us as travelers first for the people who live there, and then for us as travelers. So bettering the places we go into. And so the question we always have to ask ourselves, how do we do that? Now, I believe travel can break stereotypes, can break boundaries, can break borders. That means it does become better. But we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions and be honest about many practices we do as travelers that are harmful, and to stop those practices. Um, there are practices that we do that hurt culture, that hurt wildlife, that hurt all these things. But there's also things we do and travel that makes us care about these things. I never was a conservation person growing up, and it wasn't until I went to Vietnam and I went to Da Nang, and in Da Nang there's a monkey called the red-shanked monkey that is potentially could go extinct. It's an endangered animal, and it is absolutely the most beautiful animal I've ever seen. And I became a hardcore pro-conservation for this animal because I just fell in love with it. And so there's this power that travel has that makes it responsible, because I've done so much work to help with that, promote it, talk to people who I knew in different conservation organizations in the States, put them in touch with local organizations there. I would not have done that if I wasn't there. So yeah, I think there is a possibility. I would just add 87% of people in recent polls say they would like to travel responsibly. The problem, they don't know how. And so we have a lot of work about how. And the second problem, people mix responsible travel with eco travel. Eco travel can be irresponsible. That's one. Just because you're on an eco trip doesn't mean you're responsible. Just because you're in an eco lodge, it doesn't mean you are responsible. And you can do eco travel responsible or not, but responsible travel is much more than just eco travel. So keep that in mind.
Fantastic. Thank you. What a great, oh my gosh, everything you say is just so moving and so inspirational. So I just love how you're thinking about all of it. It gives us a lot of hope for all of us. All right, so Ketty has two questions. So the first, do you think there has been any positive effects on locals thanks to your tours? Or do you feel the impact is mostly on the perspective of the tourists?
No, it's both. That's you. Actually, this is great. And honestly, it took me a while to realize how much it is on locals. For example, one on tour guides. Two of my tour guides had like really a beautiful story. Israeli and Palestinian who started working together, didn't know each other before. 6 years later, the Israeli gets married. His wife is another Israeli Jew. The Palestinian Muslim tour guide was the rabbi with a yarmulke who officiated their wedding. This Palestinian tour guide was in Israeli prison 15 years earlier, being a fighter against Israelis. And now he's the guy with a yarmulke officiating a Jewish wedding. So that's just a one small example. But even like when you take those travelers to meet families, those families get to talk to those travelers. So you change in stereotypes on both ends. I know for my family who didn't know any Israelis before, who didn't know any tourists before, anybody from the United States, and now their relationship with this world is so different. So it definitely changes both the locals and the travelers, because it's an exchange. It's not just them telling their story. I often try to make it in a way where it's a relationship that goes both ways.
That's so true and so beautiful and such a good reminder, like you were saying before, it's just such a connector of these people. And so bringing those stories to life and hearing them is so impactful. All right, another question from Ketty is, do you do the same type of tours with the two tour guides in all of your locations, or is it done a little bit differently wherever you go?
Not all the locations, because not all locations have a clear two narratives that you want to explore. I think I do every location I work in, I try to make sure we have many voices being told, not just one. And so sometimes you have to use one guide, but then we supplement it with local tour guides. So if we're in this city, like in London, I'll run a tour in London and I take half a day tour with an organization called Unseen Tours. And it's former or current homeless people who give a tour of London, not tour of homelessness, because that would be kind of the poverty tourism, and I don't want to get into that. We can go into this conversation, but it's former homeless people who know, or current homeless people who know London really, really well, and they'll tell stories that normal tour guides won't tell you. Not again, not always connected to homelessness, just social justice issues, hidden spots that you wouldn't know about, and an amazing tour. And so if I take a group there, I hire this organization to do half a day tour. I hire, uh, you know, and in some places I'll hire, like today I was in here, I saw a friend who we hired to do some tours for us, who's an archaeologist, to do a half a day tour from an archaeologist's point of view. And so we get these different points of views. Or in Tel Aviv, I hire somebody who works with asylum seekers to give us a tour of learning about asylum seekers communities in the areas I live in. And then we go and meet with some of those community people and get to understand the reality. Tel Aviv is such a fun city, that you don't realize there are issues we kind of as a tourist don't get to see. So yeah, if I don't have two tour guides, I do that. There are many places with tour guides. Northern Ireland, we do Catholic Protestant, for example. In the United States, we just started the Red Blue tours, where we get a conservative and a liberal co-leading trips together. Really, really excited. But I'm not gonna have, for example, we do a civil rights tour. I'm not gonna do a Ku Klux Klan and a African American co-leading a trip together. That's not gonna not it's not always gonna work that way. We do meet though a former uh, white supremacist on those tours, and it's an amazing meeting usually.
Wow. And where is that tour in the US based out of?
We have a few different ones in the South. They all in the South civil rights, but we breaking them down into different sections. And then when we work with pre-organized group, we customize it to whatever they want. So I'm actually doing one for 10 days in October with a small group that they co-organize together. And we starting in Charleston, doing South Carolina, doing Alabama, doing Georgia, and doing Tennessee.
Wow, these tours are amazing. So I'm curious, what countries are all of your tours in right now?
A lot, and they're not all on the website. We're trying to update. There's Middle East all over, Middle East, North Africa, pretty much everywhere. US, Latin America, we in Chile, we in Brazil, and we in Colombia, and Cuba. Hopefully I'm not forgetting anything. And then in Europe, we're doing quite a few. My favorites are the Balkans and Ireland and Northern Ireland. These are best because they really similar to what the Jerusalem kind of model is, and the people who lead these tours are the best people in the world. In Asia, we're doing Japan, Cambodia, Vietnam. Those are the first ones that come to my mind. Vietnam, by the way, somebody asked about a place that surprised you. Vietnam is probably one of my top destinations. I love that country and I've been there so many times and just can't have enough of going there. I feel at home almost when I'm there. People are just so friendly and so welcoming, and they love Americans, which is not what you would expect, um, just based on history. So that's one. I would say Russia was also very surprising. I had so many stereotypes just from everything going on between US and Russia, and I had the best time of my life when I was there.
Amazing. Oh my gosh, you are absolutely everywhere. And I was going to second Vietnam. We went there with my kids and it was amazing. We stayed with the family. The people couldn't have been nicer. But I was going to mention Colombia for me was one where we went. Everyone was shocked that we were going there and that country blew me away. So I think, it's just getting past those perceptions.
Oh, we run tours, a lot of tours in Colombia. And Colombia is a hidden gem because just you get no. My biggest problem in Colombia is when I plan a tour, I don't know what to do because there's so much to do. And so we now planning all these different itineraries, and it's sometimes hard to convince people like Colombia is the spot to go. You can do adventure, you can do culture, you can do history, it's one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. I think second, if my memory is right. It is just so unbelievable. Music, art, there's nothing you won't find in Colombia. And I've been there so many times, and every time I'm blown away. And just people are so generous and welcoming. Opposite of anything you know about Colombia. And actually, my first time I went there, I'm so ashamed to say it. I went there not for travel. I was working with a different organization doing talks, and I watched a Vice video, was big mistake about drugs in Colombia. And they made it sound if you go to a bar, you're gonna get robbed, they're gonna put something in your drink, they're gonna take everything you have. And sure, you have to be careful and responsible. But I arrived there and I was afraid the first 2 nights I was there. I wouldn't go out, I wouldn't go to a pub, I wouldn't like I'm gonna get robbed. And then I had to get over my fear, meaning like I can't do that. And then I realized it's just the most amazing community you will meet. Bogota people often say a lot of horrible thing about, or Cali, or totally not true.
Exactly. That's why you just have to go and experience and do your tours. So, all right, on that line, so Emma was curious, what is the best way to find a tour like yours if there isn't one in the particular area we're going to?
So I'll answer that. Maybe there's another question if that's okay to answer. Somebody asked about how to travel alone to do it this way, and I think you can definitely do this alone. There won't be enough organized tours who would do this. I think the best way is to incorporate it even when you're traveling alone. There are a lot of experiences that are being created by locals now that give glimpses of this. So, for example, every destination today almost has a cooking class you can buy and go and just do a little bit of research, make sure there's some elements, at least, of responsibility with those organizations. Don't necessarily go to the big websites, big companies to buy it because they lose significant amount of their income to the commissions of those big companies. You can find them locally. So that's one thing I would say. Experiences, you've been in Vietnam, there's not just cooking classes, like everything from like how to build a lantern to how to do calligraphy to how to farm to how to you can find a lot of those standalone experiences when you're traveling alone. That really just would give you a different perspective. So that's one thing I would say. Talk to people, ask questions of people. I find most places I've traveled to, you able to do that, and be flexible to change your schedule. Don't don't have a rigid program. Be flexible to doing things that maybe you didn't think about. Don't hit, like I said, all the top 10 and top 7 or whatever things on lists. You will be amazed at what you will find when you do that. Ask people where they like to go, locals, where they like to hang out. Make sure you always go to some local cultural event. When I'm in any place, I'll ask, what's the best, I don't know, music show or something like that you think I should go attend? Vietnam, they have this amazing opera, amazing shows that incorporate music and martial and gymnastics and I know, like all these things together, and it's so incredible. So wherever you go, do that. Those things will get you to love the place, and you can do those on your own. Obviously, if you go on an organized tour who does these things, will make it easier, but you can do those on your own. Like in Bogota, the stuff I showed you, it's an organization called Breaking Borders. You can book their trips you can book their experiences 2 hours, 4 hours online and do it without an organized tour. What helps with organized tour is, I do the research basically and organize, put all of these things together. But you can definitely do a lot of this on your own as well. Or there are a few companies who do it depending on the area. So I don't think we're the only ones doing it. We focused on the peace element more than probably others, but there are a few companies that are doing similar stuff as well.
Okay, perfect. But it sounds like you're pretty much everywhere anyway. So we just need to go through you. And oh my goodness, I am getting really excited just hearing you talk about getting back out there and traveling again. So it's so exciting. All right. So Lisa and Mark have a question or a couple questions. So what destination surprised you the most, challenged you the most, and what is up next on your list to travel to?
What destination surprised me the most, challenged me the most? Well, I think I mentioned surprised me, probably Russia would be one. And which one I want to go to, you said? I haven't done much of Africa, so I'm really, really looking forward to a trip to Tanzania, especially. I have a friend who has developed tours there for 20 years, and he's been telling me I need to go, and I'm gonna travel there hopefully soon. I'm just so excited about that. So that would be what I'm looking forward best. I want to develop tours in places like Rwanda and South Africa, especially because it just fits so well with what we do. So that's what I'm looking forward to do most. And professionally and personally, I want to travel to these places. I spent a lot of time in Asia and Latin America. I haven't done much of Africa, and that's next on my list.
That's a good list and a big continent to explore. So it will keep you busy for a while for sure.
Right. I've done Northern Africa, but I feel it's very Arab, so I felt I have a lot in common with that. Well, as you start traveling more south, east, west, it starts being so different.
Exactly. Okay, so a question in terms of Jerusalem. So is it ever possible to visit Gaza Strip? So there's someone on the call who had a host person stay with them before and would love to go back and visit, but wasn't sure what you're allowed to do.
No, even I'm not allowed to go there. I filmed a web series for National Geographic a few years ago, and even then I wasn't allowed. The permits to get in there are really hard to get. What we are able to do is connect sometimes with people from Gaza who are in the West Bank. So that's a possibility. We go sometimes to learn about what's happening there on the kind of on the border between Israel and Gaza. And a few times we've tried, but it's tough to Skype with people there when we are at the border and talk to them as we are there. But the internet in Gaza is very unreliable. So you can't really promise it because you can't 100% deliver. We'll do it, but don't let people know ahead of time we're gonna do it just because we don't know what's gonna happen.
Okay, perfect. Good to know. All right, so Abigail was curious, how and when did you learn English?
Long good story. How did I learn English? I always liked English since I was a little kid. I don't know exactly fully why. My sister was studying English literature in college, so maybe that I would pick her books when I was 6 or 7 and try to read them, and I didn't understand a thing. I would sit with dictionaries, even trying to read William Blake poetry. I think I picked the hardest thing to try to learn, but I don't know. I liked it. I always was interested in meeting the others, so English was my way to do it. My cousin got a job with an international organization, and I would go and spend a lot of time in her office when I was a teenager. And then I kind of really got it when I think I started dating an American girl when I was 17, 18, and had to speak to her in English. That's probably where slowly I learned the language. And then Yeah, my writing's still not perfect, fortunately. I have good people who fix my speaking. I still do English, still have grammar mistakes quite a bit here and there. And so I have good editors who help me. But yeah, I love the language. So it's funny because today I do a lot of talks for ESL teachers on conflict resolution and language. I think language, a totally different maybe conversation than this, but language is very important when it comes to how we deal with conflicts around the world. And yeah, so that's my English story.
So interesting. So you didn't have to learn English in school. Did you have to learn another language?
We did, it was useless. We learned English in school for 12 years, and I have friends who were with me in school. Like, we learn grammar, but grammar, if you don't practice, you forget. And some of my friends 12 years after cannot today say a word in English. So it's very unfortunate. I would argue it was a waste of time. An hour every day on English, and you finish 12 years later can't speak the language. Like, tells you how uninnovative and sometimes helpful our schools can be. We had to memorize tons. I had to memorize so many stories that I don't remember anymore. Anyway, like Animal Farm, I literally had to memorize it word by word.
Wow, that's crazy. So interesting because from my perspective, being American, I always feel that every other country, every other culture knows multiple languages. And so it's interesting to hear that from your perspective, that even though you were required to learn it, you might not have been taught as much as we might think.
Right.
Yeah.
By the way, I love how many questions everyone is asking. This is so much fun to just go through. I'm like, I want to answer everything.
I know. I think I've gotten most of them. I have a couple more. So I think it was Lanny was asking, are you married or do you have kids?
No kids. Yes, I am, and she's American.
Perfect. Is she there in Jerusalem with you now?
No, she's a professor in at a college in South Carolina, and so she's still teaching right now, so she couldn't come.
Yes, that would be hard to do, I'm sure. All right, so Ketty again has a question on how comprehensible was the Arabic for you when you were in Northern Africa?
Not always. Sometimes we had to switch into classic Arabic to understand, because Northern African Arabic has some French influence. The accent is very the French influenced, and also it has sometimes some Amazigh in it. So there are words that are very, very different. So we would switch into sometimes classical Arabic to understand each other, or speaking English.
And then I had a question. So I know you all these tours that you do. So do you have a limited size? And for example, I have kids. Is there an age range or does it really matter? I know you said sometimes you customize it. So I was just curious if you can just give me a quick overview of what that would look like.
So most of our groups are on the smaller side. The question with size is interesting because it also cost question. The smaller a group is, the more expensive it is. I personally prefer smaller than bigger. So anywhere from 10 to 25 is usually manageable. Above 25, it becomes harder for group dynamic to do above 25. We would do it only, most of the times when we've done above that was a college, and they're running a class and they have 30, 35 students. So they want them to be in the same trip together, and then it makes sense. But yeah, I advise people, I think the perfect number, you don't want it sometimes too small, because if there's any issues you can't avoid, if some two people who don't get along, sometimes that's an issue. You don't want it too big where people don't really get to know each other. So 15, 20 is actually a great number.
Okay, perfect. Exciting for all of us to, when we can travel again, get back out there and book some of these. All right, Abigail, I lost it, has another question. How did you learn classic Arabic? And was that taught to you in the schools, or how did
That
you
was
learn?
taught in school.
It was.
I learned classic Arabic in school. It's also, if you Muslim or Christian, you're reading the holy books. Most people here are religious. You read them in Arabic, so that strengthens your Arabic. We had Arabic was extremely important in high school. It was considered a grade in Arabic for my high school. It was 3 times any other topics. So if you don't do classic Arabic well, it's really bad for your high school grade. So everything's 100 points except Arabic was like 300. But I love poetry as well, and Arabic poetry is really hard, classic Arabic. So you have to learn a lot to get it. And I spent quite a bit of time reading classic Arabic to get that. And I did for a long time writing some of those poetry, which I can't find any of them anymore. I did it when I was younger.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm still stuck on the fact that that grade was so much higher than the other ones. I've never heard of that before, but that's actually pretty smart to get the kids to study that.
Yeah, we needed the Arabic. It's not an easy language because the more when you go back in time, like reading ancient poetry, it's like you're reading a different language sometimes. So it's a tough. It can be a tough language. I'm sorry.
Yes, I can imagine. It's very hard. I think Spanish is hard, so I can only imagine. Wow, I think I have covered everyone's questions. If I missed any, please let me know. But just so everyone knows, if you want to save the chat, because there were quite a few good tips I saw come through, you can just click on those 3 dots on the bottom right hand, and that will save it. But I think we have covered everything. And oh my gosh, this has been absolutely amazing, Aziz. I know everyone
I
was
was told by Susan I might have